If you've built a product, landed a few customers, and maybe generated some early revenue, but you still don't have predictable growth, this video is for you. Because this is where a lot of founders get stuck. You've proven something works, but you haven't proven why it works. You have some customers, but you don't know if they represent a repeatable market. You've had some good sales, but you don't know if you have a real ICP, a clear trigger, a differentiated message, or buying journey that you can repeat over and over again. And that's when founders usually say, well, we need a GTM plan, which sounds right, but most early stage GTM plans are just fairy tales. They're built in a room, they're built off of assumptions, they're built from founder opinions, investor feedback, competitor websites, and maybe 3 customer calls that everyone overinterpreted. That's not a GTM plan. That's a creative writing project that you're confusing for a GTM plan. A real go-to-market plan is a buyer learning system. It should help you answer 6 questions. What market are we playing in? Why does this problem matter right now? Who feels the pain most intensely? What alternatives are we competing against? What message creates movement? And how do we turn that into repeatable conversations, demos, pipeline, partnerships, product feedback, and revenue? That's what we're going to break down in this video. And I'm going to show you how to build that plan using content-led growth. Now, when I say that, it doesn't mean we're going to leap into cringe factor and do a bunch of goofy crap that nobody pays attention to. This is not the post 3 times a week and cross your fingers and hope something works plan. This is content as an integral piece of a GTM operating system. And when I say that it's a GTM operating system, it means content as outbound, content as discovery, content as market research, content as trust building, content as sales enablement, content as partnership development, content as the fastest way for you to build your ICP on the fly. Because the bottom line is you're not going to get to product market fit on theory. You're going to get it from actual market signals and actual conversations that you're having with your potential buyers. And when you're having the right conversations, the market talks back. So for those of you who are new to this channel, I'm Dr. Jim. I help founder-led organizations build their ICP on the fly using long-form content, content collaboration, and content-led outbound. This means that if you're still figuring out product market fit, positioning, messaging, buying triggers, sales process, or even who your best customers actually are, I help you get in front of buyers authentically so you can actually validate the product, develop fit, and build a GTM motion that actually reflects the market and doesn't make you feel slimy in the process. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through a practical 6-part GTM plan for B2B founders, but I'm going to give you the version that most GTM advice skips, because most advice assumes you already know your market, you already know your ICP, you already know your buyer, you already know your message, you already know what channels work, you already know why people buy. But if you're early stage, that's not true. If you're in that 0 to 1 stage where you're building something from nothing, you know maybe one of those things, but odds are you probably know none of those things. And at that stage, you don't need a polished GTM plan. What you need is a GTM plan that helps you learn. So let's get into it. The first step in this GTM framework and plan is to define the market by defining the pain. So when I say define your market, it doesn't mean starting with a category. You don't start with, well, we're in HR tech, or we're in ed tech, we're in employee engagement, or we're in coaching, or we're in AI. That's way too broad. That tells me where you want to be, but it doesn't tell me why your buyers should care. The better starting point is this. What urgent or important problem are you solving? Not what feature did you build, not what category are you trying to enter, not what analyst box do you want to sit inside. What problem is painful enough that your buyer will take a meeting, have a conversation with you, show you their current process, give feedback, pull in another stakeholder, and eventually spend money? That's the market. The market isn't your product category. The market is the group of people experiencing a painful problem with enough urgency to do something about it. This is where founders get sloppy. They say things like, we help companies improve employee engagement. Okay, why now? We help teams communicate better. Okay, who's feeling the pain? We help leaders coach more effectively. Okay, what happens if they don't fix it? We help companies use AI to streamline workflows. Okay, Compared to what? Your market is not real until the pain is specific. And at that early stage, you don't define that in isolation. You define it through conversations. This is where content-led growth becomes powerful. Instead of blasting outbound emails saying, do you want to buy my thing? You use content collaboration to get in front of the market and learn. You invite CHROs, VPs of HR directors, COOs, talent leaders, operators, department heads, you name it, whatever your buying group is, into a conversation around the problem. And you're not doing this in a fake way. This is not like a 10-minute thing that you're doing as a bait and switch podcast. It's a real conversation. You ask them what's changing in their world, what problem is becoming more expensive for them to solve. What are you trying to solve this year? What have you already tried? What tools aren't working? And their list goes on in terms of the questions that you ask, but that's how you build and define your market. It's not about your TAM slide. It's not founder instinct. It's not copying your competitor's language. You define the market by listening to the buyers in your market and having them tell you what's going on. So one of the best examples that I can think of was when I was with an executive coaching organization, and this was several years back, and they had this entire playbook that just was not connecting. Literally, a couple of consultants had built it, and it must have been built in a vacuum because it had never met the market. And my first 3 weeks into the organization, I did 6,000 pieces of outreach and got nothing, like crickets. Nobody responded, not even a decline message. It was just absolutely nothing. And that told me that the playbook was built on theory, and that market was saying that nothing that we're pushing out is actually resonating with them, and that's why we didn't get any responses. So we pivoted when I was with that coaching organization, and what that led to was 300 plus deep dive interviews and conversations with CHROs, VPs of HR directors, chief learning officers, and that changed the trajectory of how we actually could go to market. It changed the directory of what's important to those buyers. We weren't guessing from the outside. We were actually having inside conversations, and that led us to better define what's important and why people actually want to buy from us. So if your GTM plan is not producing buyer conversations, it's a work of fiction. One thing that I'm curious about is how you've actually uncovered the critical pain that you solve for your customer. Now, as founders, we all have guesses into what's driving the pain for our customers, but what has surprised you when you've done that? Drop that in the comments. And once you're done with that, make sure you give me a follow so that way you don't miss any of the episodes that I have coming out every week. So once you've defined the pain, the second question that you need to get answers to is why now? This matters because nobody wakes up excited to buy more stuff. Nobody wakes up thinking, you know, what would make my life better? Another platform, another dashboard, another program, another service. Nobody wakes up thinking about that. And even if they did, they're probably also going to worry about, well, is this thing going to get used? So the pain of something new is far greater in their minds than the pain of standing still. So when you're thinking about why now and answering that question, buyers don't buy because your product exists. They buy because something in their world has changed. That change could be internal, it could be a new executive, it could be a failed initiative, it could be a missed revenue goal, it could be any number of things. It could be external things as well. It could be market pressure, budget compression, new expectation from employees, a shift in their buyer behavior. Your job is to identify the trigger and answer that question, why now? And this is where most founders confuse problem and timing. You might be solving a real problem, but if you don't understand why it matters now, your message is going to feel optional. And if your solution, product, or service is seen as optional, it's dead in the water. The job of your GTM is to connect your product to a timely business pressure. It's not enough to ask, what problem do we solve? You need to ask, why is this problem getting worse? Why are buyers paying attention now? What changed in the environment? What happens if they ignore it for another 6 months? Who inside the organization gets blamed if this doesn't improve? That's how you figure out your why now. And you find that through real conversations. And this is why long form content is such an effective GTM tool for early stage founders. A 30 or 45-minute buyer conversation gives you the context that a cold outbound campaign never will. You'll hear the language, you'll hear the hesitation, you'll hear the internal politics, you'll get a view behind the curtain of all the things that you need to learn and understand in order to effectively present a solution. And that's how you move from your solution being seen as something interesting to something that's seen as a priority. And that distinction between priority and interesting is really important because founders love interesting, but buyers will actually pay for what's urgent. So when you're building that GTM plan, the second step is to document the macro and micro forces that are creating urgency. There's a whole bunch of questions that you can ask to uncover what that looks like. But the bottom line is that the answers to those questions become the foundation of your strategic initiatives. You're not saying we built a product. You're saying the world has changed. Your current process was built for the old world. The gap that exists between the old and the new is creating pain, and here's what needs to change. That's how you build a foundation for a really strong GTM. The third step in building a GTM plan, and this is going to sound weird, is defining your ICP. But you want to be careful here because this is another place that founders get themselves into trouble. You absolutely need an ICP, but the mistake that often gets made is that you pretend that you know your ICP before your market has validated it. Too many early stage founders over tighten qualification. They qualify way too early. They say, we only sell to companies between 500 and 1,000 employees. We only sell to this title. We only sell to this vertical. We only talk to buyers with this budget. When you have traction in the marketplace, you should absolutely do that. When you're at stage 0, that's called shooting yourself in the foot. What you need to do in these situations is cast a wide net and run a lot of experiments. If you're still pre-product market fit or early in your traction journey, your job isn't to eliminate every conversation that doesn't fit your current theory. Your job is to learn which conversations are worth repeating. That means you need enough structure to avoid chaos, but enough openness to let the market surprise you. This is one of the things that I go on and on about. When you're starting from 0, tight qualification actually slows you down. You don't know enough yet. You don't know who feels the pain most. You don't know who has budget. You don't know who has influence. You don't know which title owns the problem. You don't know which trigger creates urgency. You don't know which segment has the shortest path to trust. So you need to build your ICP on the fly. Now, when I say that, that doesn't mean that you talk to just anybody. It means define a smart market boundary and use content-led conversations to identify the patterns. Your early ICP needs to be treated as a hypothesis. So an example of what an ICP hypothesis sounds like could be something like this. We believe that VP level HR leaders in mid-market companies feel this pain the most intensely because they're responsible for engagement, retention, and manager effectiveness, but they lack the internal systems to diagnose and act quickly. That's a theory. That's a useful hypothesis. Now you use your content-led GTM motion to test it. And you bring those people into conversations and you ask them about the problem and you track what they care about. You see who engages, you see who refers others, you see who asks for a follow-up, and you see who wants to see the product. And then beyond that stage, you see who's going to go get another stakeholder and into the conversation. You see who's going to actually go to a second demo, a third demo. That's how you build your ICP on the fly. And what I just described is exactly what I did when I was at Engage Rocket, where we actually came into the market with the idea that we were an HR tech, employee engagement, and performance management solution. And we actually, through this rapid iteration, ended up in the ed tech space with essentially the same solution. That's how you build your ICP on the fly. So the fourth step in your GTM plan is positioning. And positioning isn't just what makes us different. That question is too easy to answer in a way that doesn't matter. Every founder thinks that they're different. And it could be we're easier to use, we're more modern, we're AI powered, we're more human, we're more strategic, whatever. All of that's great. But the buyer isn't comparing the adjectives that you use. They're comparing options. And often the most dangerous option is just standing still. It could be the spreadsheet. It could be the internal team. It could be the consultant that they already know. It's often not another startup. It's a legacy vendor that they hate, but they understand. It's a manual process. It could be any number of things. So when you're in the process of trying to figure out your positioning, you need to map the real competition. And there's a series of questions that you can ask. What are you doing today? What's already in place? What workarounds have you expected? How painful is what you're doing now compared to the pain of learning an entirely new process? That pain question is critically important to understand where you're positioned and to help you understand what pains that they're dealing with. This is where content-led conversations actually become more useful than competitor research, because competitor research tells you what the competitor says. Buyer conversations tell you what the buyer actually believes. That's the difference. Your positioning has to account for the buyer's current worldview. So if your buyer believes employee engagement is just a survey problem, but your product is built around manager action and behavior change, your positioning has to challenge that belief. If your buyer believes that coaching is only for senior executives, but your service or platform expands coaching access to the leadership bench, your positioning has to reframe that category. If your buyer believes they already know their people problems, but their data is fragmented and anecdotal, your positioning has to show the cost of guessing. You're not just positioning against competitors, you're positioning against the buyer's current mental model. And this is where you need to be disciplined and pay attention to how you even structure your content. This is where getting tight on who your content is for, that I mentioned in this video, is critically important because it speaks to a specific audience. This is how you actually create a point of view that challenges existing mindsets in the marketplace and in your potential marketplace. That point of view is what creates the tension and starts the conversation. And those conversations are where the GTM learning happens. The fifth step is figuring out messaging. This is where everything either starts to click or completely falls apart, because a lot of founders do the first 4 steps intellectually, then ruin the whole thing with vague messaging. And we all know what vague messaging sounds like. We empower leaders to thrive. We transform employee experiences. We use AI to drive better outcomes. Great. And nobody feels anything when they hear that. While we're on the topic of vague messaging, when you first got started as a founder, what did your messaging look like? What was the thing that you thought was on point until it met the market and you had to completely change it? Drop that in the comments and let me know. I'd be curious to hear how that's evolved from where you started and where you are now. And while you're at it, once you're done with that, drop me a follow so that way you don't miss any of our future episodes. Your messaging that you're putting out in the marketplace should help the right buyer feel seen. It should make them think, this is the exact problem that we have. This is the thing that we have not been able to explain internally. This is why our current approach isn't working. Whatever you push out in the marketplace, your buyer needs to sit there and think and feel, hey, these people actually get me. And that's where leveraging content and embedding content in how you go to market and creating that collaborative environment with your buyers is a massively powerful messaging engine. Every interview gives you raw material. Every conversation gives you the phrasing. Every objection gives you a content topic. And every repeated pain becomes a pillar of what your content evolves into. That market language is what buyers actually care about. And your job as a founder is to capture it, organize it, and turn it into a strategic narrative. And when you think about how you craft a strategic narrative, there's 5 parts to it. 1, here's what's changed in the market. 2, here's why the old way is breaking. 3, here's the cost of staying the same. 4, here's the new way forward. And 5, here's why we are built for that new way. That narrative should show up everywhere. And when it does, that's when your content stops being a marketing activity and becomes a GTM asset. There are actually several clients that I've actually worked with that had existing content already in place, but it was never converting down funnel. And there was no strategy behind who you actually bring onto the show. And just the simple act of slowing down and getting focused allowed us to decide what guests to bring on, what conversations to have, and that actually baked in the springboards for us to do market research, product research, build pipeline, and get wins. And that's how you actually leverage content as a founder-led organization to build your entire sales motion and define your buyer journey as well. The whole point is to drive conversations. And I've yet to see an outbound approach that generates more conversations than spotlighting the leaders in your TAM and spotlighting their expertise. So if you want to have more doors open and want to have more conversations that's going to help you across all of these different areas, you need to look at going to market with a content engine that's going to put you right in the mix of your buyer's world and help you answer the questions that you need to answer in order to figure out whether the product or problem that you're solving for is viable. So what's the sixth step? The sixth step is execution. And when you think about the GTM advice that's out there, it's all about running one thing or another. Let's run inbound, let's run outbound, let's run partnerships, let's run paid, let's hire sales, let's build pipeline. Here's the issue with all of that. You can run all of those at the same time, but if it's not integrated and connected, it's just creating noise. None of those engines have consistent messaging that's going out to the marketplace. And that's where your entire early stage GTM gets messy. What embedding content smartly into your process allows you to do is that it creates one integrated motion. The collaboration exercise with your buyer becomes the front door. The outbound part of it invites the buyer into that conversation. That conversation creates trust. That conversation creates insight. The insight creates content. The content creates more outbound relevance. And then the relationship creates follow-up opportunities. Now, all of us have dealt with a situation where we've either hired people or outsourced outbound, and that's led to meetings. Half of those meetings ghost, and then once you complete those meetings, you never hear from those people again. When you do this the right way, when you embed content the right way and embed it into your entire GTM process, you create not only a content flywheel, you create a conversation flywheel. Because of the experience that you've given these folks, they are willing to invest more time in the conversation with you multiple times. And that's worth its weight in gold at this stage of your development. And that flywheel, that's how you get sales, marketing, partnerships, and product to stop operating like separate functions. It becomes a single motion, and that motion can be executed by one person that can play in all of those spaces. And when you're in that 0 to 1 stage, you can't hire somebody for each of those functions. You need a Swiss Army knife that can do it all and do it well enough for you to go from 0 to 1 to growth to traction. So let's make this practical. If I were building this from scratch with an early stage founder, here's the plan that I would use. I would define the market hypothesis, write down the painful problem, the buyer group, the suspected triggers, and the business impact. An example of that, we believe mid-market HR leaders are struggling to turn employee feedback into manager action. And that problem is becoming more and more urgent because retention, engagement, and manager effectiveness are now board level issues. That may be wrong, but that's fine. The goal is not to be perfect. The goal is to test that hypothesis. Then build the conversation list. Identify 100 or 200 people in and around the market, not just the perfect buyers. Include potential buyers, influencers, partners, practitioners, former operators, consultants, and category experts, and you're mapping that ecosystem. Then you create your content collaboration angle. It can't be generic. Don't invite people to just be on your podcast. That's soft and it's generic and people will see right through it. It's a low effort way to do it. Invite them for a specific conversation that reflects the problem that they actually care about. I'm interviewing HR leaders on why employee engagement programs stall between survey results and manager action. That is a conversation that HR practitioners and leaders would want to participate in. It tells the buyer what the conversation is about and it's relevant to their world. Then you embed discovery through the entire content creation process. So you embed it during the prep session, the actual conversation, you have post-conversation motions that you're going to do that. You embed that across all of those stages, and that discovery can include validating your messaging, validating your problem, validating the buyer landscape, validating your market research and intel, validating the product, all of that. That's how you shift from discovery being a stage into a process. And when you do that, that's how you actually start building alignment with your product and the buyer. The next thing that you should do is turn all of those conversations that you're having into content pillars. After about 20 or 30 interviews, you should start seeing patterns. And if you're having a difficult time seeing patterns, create a GPT or a Claude project and drop all your transcripts in there to identify the patterns that come up in those 20 or 30 interviews. Now, once that analysis is done, all of those patterns become your hooks, your outbound messaging, your sales narrative, your demo structure. That's your product roadmap input, your partner strategy, your ICP definition. All of those different elements allow you to tackle different aspects of your GTM engine all at the same time. It's the definition of building the plane as it flies. The last thing that you need to do is build your conversion paths. Not every conversation should lead to a sales call, but every conversation should have a next step. Each of these stages in that content creation process should have a springboard that leads to the next step. And that next step could be a market research conversation. It could be a product feedback session. It could be a messaging validation session. It could be a demo, a referral. It could be any number of things. But the idea is to leverage all of these as springboards to another conversation or another introduction that can get you closer to traction. The goal of all of this is to build a system where every conversation creates learning, trust, distribution, and potential pipeline. That's a content-led GTM. The biggest mistake founders make is trying to scale before they've learned enough. Scaling is a wrong conversation when you're at stage 0. The conversation that you should be focused on and have pig-headed discipline around is, how do I go from 0 to 1 and from 1 to growth, and then from growth to traction. Once you have traction, you can talk scale. So when you're at this stage, you need to pick one thing and do it with discipline till you get the learning that you need. And I would make the argument, there is no better engine for you to have deep, meaningful conversations about what's going on in your buyer world than embedding content into your process. Because that content informs so many different aspects of what you're trying to do as a founder, and it has payoffs at multiple levels, and that's before you consider the wins that you get out of it. You can't smile and dial your way to traction, especially if you're a stage 0 founder, because nobody knows who you are. You're worse than noise. Doing more of any number of things isn't going to be what pulls you towards traction. Picking a few things and just having disciplined focus on execution on those things is what's going to get you there. And my argument is that when you're starting from 0, content is that game changer that allows you to get traction in the marketplace faster than anything else that I've seen. Everything that I went through in this conversation is what I've done throughout my career. Whether we're talking about construction tech, staffing, ed tech, HR tech, TA tech, executive coaching, the principles that I laid out here have worked in all of those industries and have helped take those organizations and take those initiatives from 0 to 1 to growth to traction. Hopefully this conversation was helpful, and those 6 steps that I gave you is going to help you build out your GTM plan. If you think it was useful, drop me a subscribe, drop me a comment, let me know what was interesting and what stood out for you. If you have questions, I'll answer those as well. And if you're a founder trying to figure out how to get in front of your buyers, validate your market, and build a GTM motion that actually creates conversations, this is the work that I do. This is how I help founders. I have my booking link in the show notes. Happy to have an intro conversation, so go ahead and use that, and we'll schedule a time to talk. Tune in next time where I'll have another episode focused on helping B2B startup founders go from 0 to 1 to growth to traction.